PhD candidate and future church planner Kenny Ortiz recently commented this on my video. This might be the dumbest thing I've seen on the internet in several weeks. So guess what I did? I said, hey, why don't you come on my podcast and tell me why? We sit down to talk about what is the difference between Old Testament prophecy and New Testament prophecy? How do we know if God is speaking to us? And what should be the consequences if somebody thinks they heard from God, they share it with somebody else, but they actually got it wrong? He and I disagree very much, particularly on this point. But there were a few things that we shockingly agreed on. You're going to love this conversation, so let's jump into the episode. All right, Kenny, you and I just met 30 seconds ago right here. And we had chatted for a little bit on Instagram. But before we dive into the subject, why don't you just kind of give some context? Where are you coming from, and who are you, and what do you do, and your involvement in ministry, all that?
Yeah. I live in Orlando, Florida, right outside of Orlando, originally from Philly, PA. Shout out to any Philly fans out there. I was a pastor and professor for several years in my 30s in Minnesota, and my wife and I just moved to Orlando region about a year ago, God willing, to launch a church this fall. So Horizon City Church, we're in the process of planting that, and it's been a great, exciting, fun journey. PhD student at Midwestern Seminary, so done on my coursework, currently writing my dissertation work on modern American church history, 20th century evangelicalism is kind of the main focus. And I host a podcast called Theology for the Rest of Us. So if anyone's interested in being that, I'm married to Milena, 2 kids. They are the most fun things in the world. Letty's 3 and Josiah's 9 months. And being a daddy is probably maybe my favorite thing in the world.
Yeah, I can agree with you on that. I love being a dad. I got 2 little ones myself. Now, I didn't know you did a podcast. That's cool. I'm going to make an assumption, and you correct the assumption. I'm assuming you might be a cessationist, but I'm not sure if that's true. Because you had commented on a video where I was talking about prophetic ministry, where do you land, just maybe at a 30,000-foot view, on gifts of the Spirit? And I do think maybe you can clarify these 2 things. There's the doctrinal or theological perspective on this, and then there's kind of a ministry philosophy. Maybe a lot of churches agree on what they are, what they aren't, but a lot of them, their emphasis and the way they would handle those things are radically different. So I don't want to confuse those two.
That's a good distinction,
things. Actually. Yeah. So what is the theological perspective you have on it, and then what would be your kind of ministry philosophy on the gifts of the Spirit?
Yeah. I come from what I would call a very charismatic background. In my high school, college years, went to Assemblies of God Bible College. A lot of great friends in that world. Went through kind of a personal, significant reformation in my mid-20s. Maybe I use that word intentionally. Pretty significant shifts, and so there was a season in my life I would have called myself a cessationist. I no longer use that language. I think most of the cessationist arguments that I hear they're not good biblical arguments. That's my perspective. So I can't actually be a cessationist. I can't say that the gifts of the spirits have stopped. But functionally, when it comes to ministry philosophy, if you were a part of my ministry or part of my church, you probably would assume I'm a cessationist. You probably would assume our church is, because they would not be emphasized. And I've come to realize now at 42 that there's an error in that if you claim to be a continuationist, and that's a word, I like that word better than charismatic, to be honest. If you claim to be a continuationist, but you're functionally a cessationist, there's probably a disconnect there. And so I am currently in a moment in my life where I realize there's a disconnect, and I need to make some healthy adjustments, and still wrestling through that. And I've got great friends on kind of both sides of the charismatic cessationist debates, and I listen to them. And one of my best friends in the world is very charismatic. That's what I call him, uber charismatic. And I love him. He's one of my dearest friends in the world. We fiercely disagree on lots of things, but he's been really helpful to me in challenging me and going, hey, like, you say you're not these guys over here, but you look like those guys. Maybe there's a disconnect. So I'm currently in the moment over the last few months, and probably, God willing, for the next few months and years, we'll be wrestling through what does that really look like in a local church, and not really sure yet.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I mean, I appreciate anybody who's just like, I'm on a journey, I'm trying to figure this out. And not to say that I have it figured out, I don't. I'm just saying, because I might share a similar sentiment there. Now, I will tell you, because we don't know each other very well, or pretty much at all, I'm in a local church setting as well. My passion, similar to yours, is theology and church history. I love both of those subjects. And, but okay, so with that, I come from definitely more of a charismatic background, and, felt like I did a little bit of a pendulum swing, as most do when they maybe first enter Bible college, because I think whatever side you grew up on, if you feel like you were missing out on something and you discover good arguments for the other side, it's almost a little bit like can be a domino effect of like, oh my gosh, okay, I grew up having only caricatures of the other side.
That's right.
And so anyways, I get to a spot where I go, okay, I don't want to, good theology is not just pendulum swinging from what you think the abuse is on the other side. I want to kind of have some good middle ground. But with that being said, just so you know where I'm at, I don't get offended by people who disagree with me. So don't feel you feel free to speak openly and freely. Now, I think the way this all started was I had posted a video about New Testament prophecy. Mm-hmm. You did not seem to agree with it, which is fine. I mean, that's why we're doing this. So I would love to hear your thoughts, and you don't need to go through it line by line. I mean, you can be as broad or specific as you want, but I'm trying to remember the video. I think it was specifically about New Testament prophecy.
Yeah.
Tell me your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So first, my comment was an exaggeration, and it was snarky, and so I didn't delete it because you know what? That's kind of a fool's, or that's kind of like what's the word? Cowardly. Like if you say something, it's like, oh, that probably wasn't the best way to say that, and then you just delete it. Like, no, actually, if I say something that's inappropriate or out of line, people should know that I said it, and I should own up to that. So. The comment I made was, I think I wrote it down. That's the dumbest thing I've seen on the internet in a while. I think that's literally what I said. And
by the way, Kenny, I have said snarky comments maybe worse than that to people. So you're not alone.
So I apologize. That was snarky, and it was an exaggeration. It's not the dumbest thing I've seen on the internet this year. Maybe a better way I should have said that. A better way to say is hey, I think this is, I think your response to the cessationist arguments is unwise, unhelpful, in that vein.
Sure.
Maybe even, I would even say it a little harsher, a little stronger than that. Like, I think it's potentially harmful to people. Sure. But I wasn't specific in the entire video. You said several things that I actually would agree with, but there was one particular thing, and I actually wasn't specific, which is really unhelpful. The cessationist arguments is often things like about the New Testament prophets should be treated to the same standard as Old Testament prophets. Specifically, like, if you prophesy something, you get it wrong, you should be killed, which that was the standard in the Old Testament, Deuteronomy. And you basically said something like, well, we prophesy in part. And I thought that was the part. I'm like, well, I think that's a gross misunderstanding of what in part means there. And I don't think you actually adequately argued against the cessationists. They're saying they should be held to the same standard. Well, what in the New Testament shows us they should not be held to that standard? I think that was that deserves a more. And I think there's a good response to those guys, but I thought your response was not the best response to them.
Sure, that's fair. You probably, I think everybody understands this, but it's obviously there's like 90-second clips, so it's hard to kind of fit those all in, and that was taken from a whole podcast episode. But at the same time, it's like if I put it up there, whether it's it has full context or not, I know that people are going to react if they see holes in it or whatever, and it's like, okay, well, I only have 90 seconds. Let me explain what I was trying to say there, and you can tell me where you disagree. When it comes to the standard by which Old Testament and New Testament prophecy, actually Grudem is the one who points this out, that there are prophets in the Old Testament that we don't have their writings. So it wasn't as if there's a kind of a singular prophet who's the prophet of God for the people of Israel. But it says that there was 50 prophets who hid in a cave here. And so I'm not building a whole doctrine on that. I'm just saying there's got to be some sort of distinction between the office of a prophet and then somehow there's other sort of prophets that are not the prophet of God for the whole nation. So then we move to the New Testament. He links this thought that the apostles functioned like those prophets, the prophet for the nation in the Old Testament. That the apostles function as that kind of new. They bring revelation from God. They are writing inspired scripture. They are, there's a different seat or office that cannot be repeated. So I don't believe in apostles today. I believe people can be apostolic, or I know what people mean when they say that, but obviously there's not in the same way apostles. So I would link it to that. Now, when we get to 1 Thessalonians and some of these other chapters, to me, I go, it seems as if Paul makes wiggle room. And he says, this is why he says, I think it's 1 Thessalonians 5, if I'm remembering correct, it might be 4. But he says that, listen, you should not despise prophecy, hold on to that which is good, but test everything. And so it seems that Paul, to me, is making this distinction on prophetic ministry happening in local congregations or local churches, that you should test it and hold on to that which is good. This is not the same as apostolic writing. So that's the distinction I'm making. Those prophet for the nations, Isaiah and Jeremiah and all those are linked or similar to the apostolic role in the New Testament. And then there's prophetic functionality that is not to the same degree that happens underneath that. So I don't know if that helps, or if you would still disagree. Yeah. Tell me what you think.
No, I actually think it's a helpful distinction. I actually to reinforce the point you're making, we actually see that these two different types of prophets in the book of Acts. In Acts 11, Agabus is making the prediction of the famine to come. So that he's making a predictive prophesying in that point, it seems like. And then you've got the prophets in Acts 15, Judas and Silas, who are, they're prophets. They're called prophets, but they're not actually making predictions. They're bringing in encouragement to the body of Christ. And so we see that prophecy kind of doing two different things here. One is giving predictions and exhortations or warnings, and the others is bringing encouragement and edification, which Paul really leans on in 1 Corinthians 13 and 14. And so you have, there does seem to be different types of prophecy happening. So from the Old Testament, New Testament. So I agree with that. But it does seem to me when I read in Deuteronomy 18 that someone who's a false prophet is held to the same standard, regardless of what type of prophecy. It seems to me that Deuteronomy 18 would say anyone who's considered a false prophet is to be executed, to be silenced.
Well, I agree, but I think the distinction would be is, Hebrews chapter 1, right? Where it says in, I should have like a Bible pulled up or something, but correct me if I misquoted, I guess. But, he spoke to our forefathers by the prophets, and now he's spoken to us by the Son. Right. So this is why we know people like Joseph Smith, who claim to be a single channel revelator of who God is and have and have this revelation and dispense it. We know they're false because God doesn't speak to a singular person for the people. So in the Old Testament, we have a singular voice who's speaking the wisdom and the prophetic, the prophetic wisdom and direction from God. So of course, if somebody steps in and says, yes, I have a prophetic word, this is for the whole nation. But in my understanding of New Testament prophecy, it's rarely predictive. In terms of what it is explained or described as. And so I go, yeah, of course there's going to be higher risk, and so there should be higher standards. If somebody's claiming, I am, in the Old Testament, God told me you need to turn away and do this, and this, and this, and everybody has to listen and go, okay. But in New Testament prophecy, there is no single prophet like that for the nation. We have local prophets, if you will, just in a different scope.
Yeah, I just don't think the law of Deuteronomy applies to those people if you're getting it wrong, because it's harmful. And the reason why, now, two things. We do see that the consequences of silencing someone in the New Testament is from our vantage point, softer, less harsh. So, for example, in the Old Testament, sexual sin could be is a capital crime. Right? If certain types of sexual sin you could be executed for. Today in the local church, we're not we're not going to kill that person, but we could excommunicate them from the local church as a means of demonstrating that we don't believe that they're genuine in their faith. And so there does seem to be that the church is doing testing, so that there is rather than executing the person who's committing sexual sin, we're going to excommunicate that person. So there is a precedent that the sentencing is not as harsh in the New Testament from our human vantage point. But I don't think that the sentencing is completely suspended, or that we don't hold all prophets accountable necessarily.
No, I agree with that. We should hold all accountable, but I think, so maybe this clears it up, maybe not. I think the problem with the Deuteronomy 18 argument, though, is we are holding people to a standard, to an office that doesn't exist anymore. Yep. So the office of the prophet and the role of that in the Old Testament, that office and how it functioned just doesn't exist in the New Testament. And that was what I was trying to get at when I was saying that is similar to the role of the apostle in the New Testament. I'm not saying it's a one for one, but I am saying that there are some similarities there. So that's why I struggle, and really that's the frustrating part to me when people go, these two arguments are the most frustrating. Deuteronomy 18, when it's like, stone the person if they get it wrong. It's like, that's just such a quick, literal surface read. Now, I know there's more nuance to it that you're getting at, and I appreciate. And you're distinguishing some of the distinctions between Old and New Testament. But then the second one is just that I do not understand and I can't get behind. And I know you're not arguing for sensationism, but we have the New Testament, we have the Bible, we don't need to hear from God. And it's like, I guess it depends on what we mean by hearing from God and what we mean by prophetic ministry.
I think that's a big part of it. Yeah.
Yeah, because it's like I could agree with you, but I think we're going to define what hearing from God and prophetic ministry means. Mm-hmm. Because I grew up thinking that a prophetic person meant this. They were predicting elections and they were giving, like, I can't stand it when I get on Instagram and somebody has a word for the nation. It's like, this is what the people of God, because it's just careless. And how do we hold that? That should be held to a higher standard, right? But if I feel like the Spirit just, this is my favorite definition of prophetic ministry. It's when God spontaneously brings something to your mind or lays something on your heart, usually for somebody else. Just that simple. I think that's a generic, helpful. It's not predicting everyone's future. Can that happen? Well, sure, I guess that can happen. I don't think that's a normative experience. What do you agree or disagree with that?
Yeah, I guess the crux of the argument is that, does Deuteronomy 18 apply to anyone who's a prophet? That would be the question. Or is it just only those who hold the office? So even those, I'm going to use the word lesser prophets. That's probably not the best word to use, but even those prophets who were not prophets to the nation, I would think in the Old Covenant, we still held them to Deuteronomy 18. And so in the New Covenant, we don't just hold the apostles to that standard. We hold anyone who's prophesying. And partly the reason I hold to that is when I'm reading through 1 Corinthians 13 and 14, Paul seems to be referring to the encouragement variation of prophecy, the Acts 15 Judas and Silas variation, not the Agabus predictive variation of Acts 11. But he says I wrote it down. So in 1 Corinthians 14:34, I don't want to get into women ministry. That's a whole different argument. But he says this: the women should keep silent.
We only have an hour, Kenny.
Oh gosh, I do. Yeah, that's not going to do that. We could, but maybe another day. The women should keep silent, for they are not permitted to speak, but should be in submission. And then here's the key phrase at the very end of the verse that Paul says, "As the law also says." So Paul is saying that the reason why I'm giving these instructions to women and men and women how things should function is because the law speaks to us as to how things should be governed. So it seems to me what Paul is saying is the Old Testament law, while it's not an exact replica, obviously the New Testament's better, there are still elements of the Old Testament law that should govern and inform how we think about the church ordering. And it's right smack in the middle where he's talking about prophecy and tongues. So it's like, prophecies for encouragement. So giving your definition earlier, prophecy is probably a definition I probably could say, yeah, I probably agree with that. Maybe I would, give a little different. But I think even in that, the Old Testament should still speak to be a part of this. So I think, like as I said, the sentencing is less harsh, but the principle of silencing the false prophet still applies. And it seems like Paul he's bringing that up, saying the law still is at work when we're talking about how to order the local church.
Sure. Can you remind me what chapter and verse were you reading from? I just want to make sure.
1 Corinthians 14:34.
Oh, okay. I was in 12.
Sorry.
No. Yeah, that's good. Go ahead.
The one other thing that we can come back to this if you want to go down that, but the term "in part" that Paul uses in 1 Corinthians 13, I think maybe that's the biggest disagreement I would have with your video I saw, was that your definition in part seems very different than what I think it is.
Well, let's go to it then. What is your understanding of prophecy and fart? I just said prophecy and fart. Make sure we'll clip that for Instagram.
That's good.
Prophecy in part. Okay, this probably is going to be helpful because this is going to get to the heart of what prophecy is and how it functions differently. So, explain to me what you think that means, and we can dive into that.
Yeah, and I don't think it's not a secretive word. It's not a hard word to understand, because the Greek word that we translate as "in part" or "part," it's used 43 times throughout the New Testament. So it's not a confusing. You can look up each instance. You could read the context. And it's one of the more common ways that the word "in part" is used is actually to describe a region. So sometimes, like in Matthew and the Gospels, it's in part. The part of is referring to a region or the coast. In other portions, it's talking about a portion, so it's an amount or regions. And so the word "in part" means you're going to a particular arena. So it feels to me, that what Paul is saying is we're going to prophesy in certain arenas. There are certain topics, certain subjects, certain areas of society, or certain elements of our lives where we're going to be able to prophesy effectively. And then there are other arenas where we're not going to have any prophecy. So prophecy is going to be limited in that we're not going to be able to prophesy on everything. I don't know that we're going to be able to prophesy about elections. I don't know that that's an arena that we should be speaking into. What I don't think in part meaning is that we're going to prophesy and occasionally get it half right or partially right. No, it's and then in that same verse, Paul uses the word "know." We know in part, we prophesy in part. The word "know" there is used 223 times in the New Testament. Again, not a hard word to understand. And it's always referring to thoroughly understanding something, or even it's used for men and women who are being intimate. So intimately being acquainted with something or being intimate with something. So Paul's we know in part. So there are certain things that we know, we're experts on this area. We're intimately acquainted with it. We know this really well. But then there's other areas, other regions of life that we're not going to know a lot about. And so that's not the area that we're stepping into. So I think what I heard you saying in your video was prophesy in part means that when we prophesy, sometimes we're going to get a couple details wrong, but other times we'll get it fully right. No, and I don't think that's what Paul's saying there. I think Paul's saying we're going to prophesy, and when we prophesy, we better get it 100% accurate. But we're not going to prophesy in every arena of our life. There's some areas that we should just stay out of because our knowledge is limited, because we see dimly right now, as he says in the next verse. Verse 15, I think. We see dimly. We don't see clearly. There's going to come a day where we see every arena clearly. Right now, we only see a few areas clearly. We can prophesy in those areas, and you better be right every time, because there's a high standard as of Deuteronomy 18. But there's going to be areas where we don't know, and it's okay to not prophesy. I think that's the key difference between, I think, what I heard you saying and what I think Paul is saying. Yeah,
I mean, that's interesting. I haven't heard that take before. I don't agree, though. I mean, I don't get the idea of, and maybe you can help me with this. Even if I look up the Greek word for "in part" and it's talking about arena or these different spheres, I mean, to me, as I'm reading this through 1 Corinthians, 13:8, love never ends. As for prophecies, they will pass away. Well, of course, obviously they'll pass away when we're face to face, right, with the Son of Man, and there's no need for any sort of prophecy. Right. They will cease. As for knowledge, it will pass away. And then it says, for we know in part. But I don't understand how that could mean we know certain areas really well, It's talking about things that we have right now that are not going to be needed. Love will continue in the new heavens, new earth, when we're glorified and resurrected. Prophecy there won't be a need there. He says, and basically right now though, we only know in part and we prophesy in part. I don't see the connection to where Paul goes from, we won't need knowledge in heaven. Knowledge will cease. We'll still have love. We won't need prophecy. And then he says, we know and we prophesy in part. At minimum, I think we might be a little bit closer than I think we were at the beginning, even if it's these certain arenas. I don't know if there's no arena though that we know totally. Everything we know, even in whatever arena it is still partial knowledge. And so I would you agree with that?
I mean, I guess we'd have to judge every single arena and determine. I don't know that.
Well, but right, but that's why I go. I think it's difficult for me to think that Paul, as he's moving through this text, writing to them, and this is this is the church that is the most eager for spiritual manifestations. He says that,
yeah,
and he doesn't tell them because of their disorderly worship, you guys need to tone it down and stop. He does to some degree, but he wants to infuse order into what they're doing, right, and unity and holiness and all those things.
Yeah.
And he says, we know in part, we prophesy in part, and when the perfect comes, that partial will pass away. So right, we'll have a better understanding.
Right. We're gonna the dichotomy between the parts that we do know and don't know, that dichotomy is gonna go away. The partialness of our knowledge will be gone. We're gonna see everything clearly at that point.
So let's talk about how this works out functionally, because I disagree that whenever somebody prophesies, they're going to be 100% right, because that again, not to keep going over the same point, but that would be similar to the person who God is speaking through inspired scripture in the Old Testament. And I go, well, obviously we both agree that the canon's closed, and God.
Praise God, we agree on that's good.
All public revelation has ceased for certain. And so, here, let me explain this, and you tell me, and then you can comment on and stop me at any point. The Bible says in the book of Numbers that Moses had a unique ministry with the Lord, and he was able to talk to him like a friend, face to face, not with riddles and dreams and things like that, which is pretty cool actually. Like, if that's how it's described to you, like God communicates to you differently than all the others, like that's pretty cool. And then and Moses is obviously the giver of the Torah, obviously through the Holy Spirit and all that. But every prophet after Moses does not give any new Torah. They do not give any new law. Every prophet after that is getting the wisdom of God, the mind of God, the heart of God, etc., to bring people back to that covenant that was made with Moses. And so, even Jeremiah, the weeping prophet, he's not coming up with new revelation in the sense that, here's more law, or it's God speaking to him, come back to the covenant, come back, repent, turn from your idols, turn from this. And so in the New Testament, Jesus and the apostles, Jesus is like the new Moses. He's the giver of the law. He says, you've heard it said before, but I say, he has this authority, and he actually builds upon that. And then you have the apostles who function like the prophets after Moses. And then there is prophetic ministry. So there are not prophets in the same way. Like when it says in Ephesians chapter 4, where it says, the foundation was laid by the apostles and the prophets. I believe that's obviously talking about the prophets of the Old Testament and the apostles of the New. Those do not continue.
Right.
But there are prophets, lowercase p, prophetic people who, I know we disagree about this, prophesy in part. And I think functionally, just like somebody could have the inspired, inerrant word of God in front of them, and it's clear as day as what it says, we all don't preach or teach in a vacuum, and the filter could be, we could misinterpret something and communicate it. I believe similarly, God could give me a burden for something. It's from the Spirit of God. He's not asking me to do something weird, but man, I just feel like I'm supposed to go encourage them. I may not even know that's from the Lord. They came to my mind. I'm going to shoot them a text or call them or pray for them or whatever. And I could get something off in that filter. And that doesn't, the reason to me, we still hold people accountable to prophecy. But the reason that the Deuteronomy 18 thing doesn't apply is because I'm not speaking on a similar level of authority to any degree. I'm not speaking on that authority. I think the essence of prophecy, sorry, I'm ranting. I'll wrap this up. But the essence of prophecy is not to judge the people of God, govern the people of God, direct the people of God, or reveal revelation to the people of God as it functions in the Old Testament. Just the nature of prophecy is somewhat similar and somewhat different. The nature of prophecy in the New Testament, this is why Paul is so eager for them to do the things that are best for the edification of the body, is for, as my pastor said growing up, building up, cheering up, stirring up. That, in my understanding, that is the essence of the prophetic nature of the New Testament. So that's why I think prophesying in part, or even if I'm wrong about that interpretation, which I don't think I am, but that we can move past that.
I mean, you got a wrong definition, like literally, but that's okay. I mean, like,
but here's the thing though, is
I'm just saying, like, there's a definition for that word in the New Testament, and you're using a different definition. So that's okay. But, anyway, I cut you off. Sorry. Go ahead.
No, you're fine. So let's come back to the definition of that word in just a minute. But what do you? Does that make sense? Do you disagree with that?
I think there are a lot of things that you're wrapping into prophecy. It seems to me that I would maybe put in a different category. I wouldn't call it prophecy.
Okay. Like what?
And so like when you're just saying like, oh, I just feel maybe the Lord is stirring in me to like go encourage someone. Like maybe that's just different. Encouragement is a spiritual gift. It's a different spiritual gift than prophecy. And so maybe that person has a gift of encouragement. Well, it's absolutely possible that in my conversations, I may try to encourage someone, and maybe get some details of what I was discerning, and may get some things wrong. But I'm not prophesying necessarily in that moment. I'm using a gift of encouragement.
Is it prophetic? Sorry, just quick. Is it prophetic in some sense? If you're walking on the sidewalk and just, for your lunch break today, and out of the blue, just someone pops up in your mind, and just in this hypothetical situation, it's clearly of the Lord, and you feel like you're supposed to call and encourage them. Is that in some way prophetic?
I mean, I guess I wouldn't use the word prophetic for that. I would supernatural, spiritual, God led, Spirit led. We're to be to keep in step with the Spirit. We are to walk with the Spirit, and so maybe I'm not trying to play coy with words. I just to avoid confusion. Maybe it's helpful to just say that's it, man. One of the spiritual gifts that stands out to me, that I kind of going back to the very beginning, like saying like I feel like I need to cultivate some of the things in my own personal life better, is the gifts of knowledge, which is distinguishable from prophecy. In 1 Corinthians, Paul gives that list, and he distinguishes a difference. Prophecy and words of knowledge seem to be in different categories. So there have been moments in my life where I've known things about someone. This is many years ago. I'm driving down the road, and I had this weird thought pop. I shouldn't say use the word weird. In the moment, it felt weird, honestly.
Sure.
This thing popped in my brain. Hey, pray for so and so. She's going through a hard time. Mm-hmm. And I'm okay. That's interesting. And so then I was at a red light, and I prayed for the person. And then when I got to my destination, I sent this person a text message. I hadn't talked to her in several years, and just said, "Hey, hope you're doing well." Blah blah blah. Whatever. Generic text. I just thought about you this morning. I think the Lord maybe brought you to my mind. Praying for you. Hope you're doing well. Whatever. And she responded back a few minutes later. Oh my gosh, that's so incredible. Like she was going through this incredibly hard time. Someone truly close to her had just died. And so, like, I remember being like, wow, like I didn't know the details of that situation. Mm-hmm. There's no doubt that was supernatural. That was a gift from God in that moment. Mm-hmm. And so maybe, like, is that prophetic? I guess maybe. I don't use that language to describe that moment, but I guess maybe it's in the category. But that's different than me getting up in front of the church and giving a prophecy to the congregation. Like those feel different to me.
Well, are you defining prophecy strictly as like an authoritative word of God that's about some sort of predictive future thing? Is that how you would define it?
Going back to Acts 15, there are these other variations of prophecy that are more about encouragement. And so if I had called my friend and said, hey, the Lord told me this, well, I think in that moment I'm now entering into prophecy, and I better be right. I think there's a Deuteronomy 18 standard for me, and that if I violate that, then I need to be silenced. I'm not saying be executed, but be silenced. So, which is different than the gifts of knowledge and trying to be an encouragement and pray for my sister in the Lord.
Sure. Well, I think in large part it does help with the approach. So I've gone to people and I do not say, hey, the word of the Lord saith unto you, or something like that. I've gone to somebody before and go, hey, I was praying the other day and I feel like the Lord placed this on my heart. Maybe I'm wrong about this. I try to have a humble thing there and go, hey, take this, you pray, you go to your pastor. And I think that falls in line with kind of how Paul talks about it in 1 Thessalonians. I mean, he does tell people, hey, hold on to that which is good and test it. Don't despise prophecy. He kind of talks to both the charismaniacs and the people who don't want anything to do with supernatural stuff or whatever. And he says, stop despising it. This is good. And then he says to the other folk over here who just takes every single Facebook, prophet.
That's right.
and says, stop accepting everything that you hear and you think is from the Lord. You should test it.
Yeah. I think that verse actually really speaks to the cessationists of our era because there's false prophets. People go, okay, all prophecy is bad, and they want to despise it.
Right.
And Paul is in essence saying, hey, yes, we know there's some weirdos, yes, but you shouldn't hate all of prophecy just because there's some weirdos in the mix. That's not helpful. So I would agree. I agree with your sentiment there. But if someone is, I guess I see Paul saying the Old Testament law. I don't see a distinction between the greater prophets and the lesser prophets. Again, that's maybe not the best way to describe them, but of the Old Testament, I think Deuteronomy 18 is applying to all of them. So if you're stepping into something that's prophetic, there's a standard that's really high. I don't think necessarily. I think maybe where we might disagree is some of these things that you're doing that you would say is prophetic. Maybe I would use different language. So then, no, I don't think that Deuteronomy 18 applies in those scenarios. So I guess we would agree Deuteronomy 18 does not apply to some of those scenarios, but we would disagree on how to categorize or describe those scenarios.
So Deuteronomy 18 applies to me in principle to, as I brought up earlier, to people like a Joseph Smith, because they're claiming something different than what I'm claiming. And I don't think Paul would have the same sentiment, as he says in 1 Thessalonians, don't despise prophecy, but test it. I mean, I'm saying the principle's still there, but we're talking about two different things. In one hand, we're talking about somebody who is claiming to speak an authoritative word from God that is on equal playing ground of Scripture being written, right? Or is the sole communicator between God and the people. Since we don't have that anymore,
right?
That means that there's no need for that sort of office or prophetic ministry to continue.
Correct.
And because, we already agree that the New Testament describes prophetic ministry in a few different ways.
Right.
We might disagree on all the parameters for that, but it is vastly different than the way it is described in the Old Testament. Therefore, prophetic ministry does in some way, whether we agree or not on the minutia of it, some way takes on some sort of different form. It's now described more as like a gift versus an office. And with that gift, like any of the other gifts, people get in the way and they can mess it up. And that's why humility matters. That's why people should be careful with the way in which they communicate, what they feel like maybe God is communicating to them, if that makes sense. So, yeah.
I think maybe the 1 Corinthians 14:34, when Paul says, I'm giving you some instruction. He's talking about women in that case. But the reason I'm giving you this instruction because the law says, this is in line with the law. And so I am hesitant to not look at the law and go, Deuteronomy 18 does seem to apply to more than just that Joseph Smith character. I think it's a little broader than that.
Okay, to what degree? Because then why would we not uphold the entire part of it?
The entire part of the law?
Well, no.
What do you
I
mean?
mean, to what? Sorry. No, I realized that didn't make a whole lot of sense. Two questions. One is, to what degree do we hold somebody accountable to that same extent? And if we're not holding them to the same extent in terms of obviously the execution, why is there such a different? Why is the way in which prophecy is spoken about so much different in the New Testament? So there's a few questions in there.
Yeah.
But to what? Let's start with this. To what extent does it apply?
Deuteronomy 18, you mean?
Yeah.
The principle of Deuteronomy. So obviously, Old Covenant, New Covenant. Old Covenant is obsolete. Hebrews tells us we have a brand new covenant, not a refurbished version of the old. We have a brand new covenant. There are elements of the old covenant that are reestablished in the new. Yeah. And then, as we are mediating the new covenant, we can look back at the old covenant. This is, it would just take us a long time, but this is the pattern I think I see in the New Testament, is that we're using wisdom from the Old Testament to help us mediate the new, understand and how to mediate the new covenant. And so it seems like Paul is doing that in 1 Corinthians 14. He's saying, just like the law said, like the reason why I'm saying this thing about women and prophets is like, because the law said that thing. You're like, oh, so there, Paul is looking back at the law, and he's not telling them to execute the people. So Paul's not giving the instruction to do what we did in the Old Testament. He's simply saying there's something about the law that gives us some wisdom on how to navigate this situation. Now, I want to also admit that
just real quick, what's the verse you're referring to again? Is it the same one as earlier?
1 Corinthians 14:34.
Oh, okay. Yeah, same one. Sorry. Keep going.
And he says this elsewhere in the New Testament. He uses this sort of language, kind of harkening back to the law. And interesting, what he's actually citing there is from Genesis, not from, it's pre-Mosaic law. So there's this idea of like it. What I was going to say a moment ago was I have to acknowledge that it's not precise. Paul doesn't precisely tell us this exact thing in the law, do it exactly the same way. He's simply saying, hey, I'm giving you some instructions. And the reason I'm giving you these instructions is because of some of the things that the law says. Because the law says. Now, the exact instructions he gives in 1 Corinthians 14, they don't appear verbatim in the law. Like, so we have to kind of guesstimate, okay, Paul is looking back at the Old Testament, and he's trying to bring wisdom from the New Testament. He's not telling us to do it exactly. And so I'm simply trying to do the same thing. Okay, if the Old Testament says we silence false prophets in the Old Testament by killing them, the New Testament, that doesn't seem like that would be the appropriate thing, but there does seem to be a silencing that takes place. Certain people are silenced.
Should we silence somebody who gets something wrong in their preaching or teaching? Maybe nothing major. We're not talking about like a core tenet of the faith. They're denying the Trinity or something like that. Right. But they screw it up. And they're learning, and maybe they change their mind later. Yeah. Is that different in your mind?
I think it's appropriate to have if there's a man in my church preaching and he's preaching doctrine, something that I think is wrong. I think it's appropriate for me to silence him, meaning, hey, you're not going to preach until you've got this correct. We're gonna stop you. And there's why over and over again we're told the preachers should be people who have great sound doctrine. I mean, that's a really high expectation. And so yes, and there are certain people that if they had certain doctrines, I wouldn't let them preach in my church. I would say, hey, you're not going to preach. I don't think you're a heretic necessarily. I don't think you're a false teacher. Sure. Meaning false like a wolf in sheep's clothing, like you're not really born again. But yes, I would silence that person for certain teachings.
But they can, but maybe it was just done in honest ignorance, or they just misinterpreted a passage. But they can come back and preach or teach again, like if, they go, okay, yeah, I messed that up. I'm learning, I'm growing. I want to, they can come back. It's not like they're banished from ever preaching or teaching.
Yeah, I get it. But if someone, I guess it goes back to our definition of prophecy. If someone gets a mistake in something that you would call prophetic that I would not, then I guess I'm not holding them to, like if in the situation you were saying, hey, I called my friend and I felt like the Lord is encouraging me to say this or whatever it may be. But if you get something there wrong, that's a lesser error. That's not prophetic, so to speak. Or someone who gets up and who's preaching and they preach, they stumble over something or they misspeak, and it's a much lesser error. Okay, then the sentencing or the response is lesser than if you got up and you're Joseph Smith. So there's degree, which is wisdom was also in the law. In the law, not all of the sins are treated the same. And so, yeah, I think it's situational. The more harsh or more egregious mistake needs to be dealt with more harshly or more seriously.
Okay.
You accidental misspeak is dealt with differently, but it doesn't mean we just say, maybe you're not saying this, but I get the sense from some people, it's like, well, you get it a little bit off, but it's not that big a deal. Like, you're just going to let it slide. Well, I wouldn't let it slide if it's a sermon that's slightly off or if it's a prophecy that's slightly off. I think it needs to be addressed either way. I don't know if I answered your question there.
No, I think it's good. I think a lot of this comes down to a difference in what we mean by prophecy and stuff like that. And I think that's the point's been made there. But help me understand one thing, and then maybe we can do some final thoughts here because we got about 12 minutes or so.
Yeah.
You had mentioned, one of my favorite quotes from I think it's Jonathan Haidt, who said, "You should argue like you're right, listen like you're wrong."
It's actually really good.
Yeah. So I'm genuinely trying to understand, where you're coming from, even though you're wrong. No, I'm just kidding, Kenny. I had to throw that out. Okay.
It's good. It's good. I might be wrong. 1
Corinthians 14:34. And if you don't have an answer for this right now, like, it's not like I didn't do like a bunch of prep work or anything for this. I just thought, okay, we'll talk. We'll see where this goes. It's not like I have 100 verses laid out and I need you to exegete every one of them or something like that. 1 Corinthians 14:34. You had mentioned, okay, so I'm reading the ESV. I'm not sure where your go-to is, but you had mentioned the law here. For women should keep silent in churches. They're not to be permitted to speak, but should be in submission, as the law also says. So help me understand how this, and I'm asking this sincerely, this is not a gotcha moment, how this has to do with prophetic nature in Deuteronomy 18. I know you're talking about a principle of Deuteronomy 18, but when this, to me, with all humility, that seems like such a stretch that we end up at Deuteronomy 18 when we're talking about gender roles in the church, and then he says, as the law says, referring to male and female roles. So, but maybe I missed it, or maybe
yeah.
So
I may not have
expand on that.
This is not the only. It's the only one I can think of. I know that there are other instances where Paul uses this same language.
Sure.
Here's as though. So he's giving instructions to the Church of Corinth on what's expected from men and women.
Yeah.
Right, in this context, and what women should or should not be doing in the local church. They should be in submission, and then he gives the reasoning as to why he thinks they should be in submission. And that is as the law says. Because Paul seems to think that the reason why women should do certain things or not do certain things is because he's looking back at the law and he's learning something. He's gleaning from the law, which I think is an interesting point, which just shows the precedent that Paul looks back at the law and he utilizes the law. He looks back at the law. He gains wisdom from the law as a means of understanding how the New Testament church should be ordered. So then I take it a step further and go, every time we are ordering the church, whenever we're doing how the church functions, one thing we consider, amongst others, is the wisdom we gain from the Old Testament law. The Old Testament law is not binding on Christians, but there's wisdom there to be had for those of us today. And so I think that applies in many areas, not just with women, as I think Paul does this a few times throughout the New Testament. So whenever I'm coming to the prophecy, I'm going, okay, there were prophets in the Old Testament, there's prophets in the New Testament. They're described differently. There's some similarities and some differences. And as you said, there's an office and there's not an, like, okay, so I'm trying to grapple with understanding the difference between the old and the new. And I'm just trying to follow Paul's example that seems to be why I look back at the old and I try to glean to the new.
Yeah.
That's my, I don't know, hope that's.
Okay. No, okay. That makes more sense. That makes more sense. I think that just maybe in closing here, just maybe final thoughts from each of us, but when I think about, usually when the scriptures talk about, the prophets and the law, it's kind of an all-encompassing term or word for, it can mean different things. But when I think about the prophetic ministry in the New Testament, it's interesting that, Hebrews 1, who, and I'm swayed that the book of Hebrews is written by Paul, but it might not be. But regardless, it says God has spoken to us by the prophets, now through his son.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so somebody, if they just stop there, they might go, oh, okay, so there's no more prophecy. But then it's rampant through some parts. I mean, it's not like it's the most talked about thing, but it's not like there's one verse here. It's talked
there's
about.
A lot. Yeah.
There's a lot. And so then we go, okay, the New Testament apostles are making some sort of distinction. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So and if we misdiagnose, we'll mistreat the problem here. So that's my concern, is
that's fair,
convoluting things too much. And then on top of that, and maybe I'll end it with this, but whenever New Testament prophecy whenever prophecy is talked about in the New Testament, there's nothing that's mentioned like Deuteronomy 18. And I think that's because there's nothing that resembles the same thing as the prophets in terms of a spiritual gift in the New Testament. So the reason I don't think, well, it's just less harsh is, I mean, Paul has no problem being harsh. He has no problem telling him, hey, give him over to the realm of the devil. This dude's sleeping with his mother-in-law. And disgusting.
Paul's not. It's the actual covenant itself doesn't have the same harsh conditions.
The covenant itself doesn't have the same harsh conditions, but also what we're talking about
in our era,
but also what we're talking about is two different things. And I think you recognize that, but it's to what extent. So here's what I would agree with you on principle. We should hold people accountable to what they're teaching. We should hold people accountable if they are sharing something that they believe to be prophetic. We absolutely should hold people accountable. What that looks like and to what extent, we might disagree on, but I agree in that principle. I just don't think I don't think on my end it's helpful for Deuteronomy 18 to be the verse, because we have New Testament passages that talk about how to deal with some of this stuff and what it's for and what its purpose is. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, we do. We've got 1 John 4 that tells us test the spirits and find out which ones are false. 2 Corinthians 13, where Paul says test yourself to make sure you're actually in the face. You're looking for what's genuine. 1 Peter or 2 Peter 2, where Peter says be on guard for false teachers and false prophets and false teach. Jesus in Matthew 7:24. Paul, at least by my count, at least 14 times throughout his letters where he specifically says, be on guard for false teaching, false prophets. Dozens of times in the Old Testament, obviously, Jude. So there is this pattern where we ought to be on guard, always looking for things, right? Testing things and trying to determine if they're genuine. And then Paul says to Timothy in 1 Timothy, there are these people in your church that they think they know the law and they think they know God's way. They think they know what they're talking about, but they actually don't know what they're talking about. Don't let them teach, Timothy. Like, have them shut up. Don't let them get up and talk. He says in 1 Timothy 1, it's the group he's talking about. And then he goes on, and there's other groups of people that are sinful as well. And he says, murderers and sexual immorality and people who disobey their parents. These interests is like, so the people who think they know what they're talking about, but they're actually going to get it wrong. Hey man, they shouldn't have a place speaking in the church. And there's this sense of like, we should be on guard for this. And if you're going to get it wrong, hey man, we're going to shut you up until we're confident you're going to get it right. The stakes are too high. Mm-hmm. And so I agree with you. Like there's like some of the things you described as like what you would describe prophetic. I'm like, yeah, that's probably fine. I guess I wouldn't have used the word prophetic. But even in those cases, there's some damage. And I guess it goes from my charismatic background. See so many things that I would say are abuses. People who make like life altering decisions. Yeah, right. Like a girl I don't know who switched colleges because someone gave her a word that she was going to meet her husband at this other college, and like oh boy, she didn't meet her husband. Like that's a true story. And I'm just like, I know people who are like they got a word from the Lord. I know someone who walked away from faith because they heard a word from the Lord that turned they were going to be healed of their seizures, and they weren't. And so I've seen those things.
I share that sentiment with you,
and maybe that's the reason why.
Yeah.
So I'm just like, man. Prophets, like if you're going to call yourself a prophet or do prophetic stuff, the standard for me is extremely high. And if you do anything that's even slightly off, like I'm just going to have you shut up for a while until we know for sure you're not going to mess that up. Then there's these other things that you would label prophetic that I'll go, maybe I'm going to be gentler there, but I still want people to be very diligent and very cautious and careful.
Sure. I share that similar sentiment. I could share some stories similar to what you said. And when I hear that kind of stuff, there's a few things I think, and I want to be careful with time here, but there's a few things I think. I go, that concerns me as well. And usually I feel like people who, this is me making a big broad stroke, statement, but usually people who make those sort of prophecies, I just go, it might be because they come from a church where it's loosey-goosey with all this stuff, and so it's like a cultural thing for them. But sometimes it's just pride. It's like, oh, I believe that God has gifted me. And maybe they even do maybe God does share it with them prophetically sometimes, but there's just pride in it. There's no humility. And so they don't know how, and so they get gung-ho on stuff and they just start saying, so anyways, there's so much we could talk about the practical side of it. But I think if anybody ever shares something that they feel like is from the Lord, whether if we don't want to use the word prophetic, just if they feel like God speaks to them in some way to share with somebody else, and it's something that is going to change the course of their life in some degree, I absolutely think the person who's giving that should be extremely humble, maybe even talk to their authority first, like their spiritual authority, or, hey, I just want to submit this to you. I could be off. I appreciate that so much, that sort of humility. And maybe the difference here is that sort of humility, and maybe they take that to the pastor and they go, I don't think this is for them. If you knew the situation, I don't go, you need to be quiet and silenced. I go, hey, let's talk about this process. I want you to grow in this, just like in any gift. And I'm thankful that you brought it to me. My principle is, I love what St. Thomas Aquinas says, nobody gets excommunicated for sinning. People get excommunicated for stubbornness. And
that's true.
And so I think the approach, and with humility and all that, goes a long way. But that's more of a ministry philosophy thing versus just a doctrinal thing.
Right.
We don't have all the ins and outs. So I'll give you the last word here.
Austin, you've been incredibly gracious. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
And I think we are far closer, and
sure.
And maybe it's less doctrinal, maybe slight doctrinal, but really the outworkings of it feels like that's where maybe we might have some different approaches, but not dramatically different. Yeah. And then maybe that's the area that I even care most about and want to be. Yeah. I just want to encourage everyone, just be very humble, be very cautious, because I've just seen a lot of hurt in the process.
I agree with that. And really probably what was one of the most helpful resources, there's been a bunch, because I've read a bunch about the spiritual gifts and stuff like that, because I do care about them. And I came out of a movement where that was really highlighted. I wanted to find out what I believe. But Wayne Grudem has a lot of stuff on prophecy of the New Testament. And I think it's really clear, and I think it's really helpful. I'm not saying it's the best thing out there. I don't know, but it was really helpful. So for anybody listening or watching and want to dive deeper, that's just one resource. But Kenny, I genuinely appreciate, like, you took time out of your schedule. You got a family and you're doing all kinds of stuff to hop on to my thing. And so I appreciate that. Maybe we'll do a part 2 on something else one day. I don't know. And thank you so much.
Thank you for your time, brother.